What is the disadvantage of non-mana champs? So one of the things you have to think about with a non-mana champ is what their specific kit would look like if it had mana. So what I mean by that is, so we mana gate Yasuo. What would be different? We mana gate Viego. What would be different? We mana gate Lee Sin. What would be different, right? So, and the answer to that question is, mana often is, for starters, an attritional resource. It is something that says, specifically during the laning phase, if you spam your spells forever, you eventually will have to go home. That's like the major reason mana exists in League of Legends nowadays. There's some exceptions to that. There's a few characters who are like, play more of the mana game. Characters like Karthus, Anivia, Kassadin, Ryze, where like they have these like actually like spending patterns that actually like convert mana into like raw power in certain ways. But for the average League of Legends champion, if they do have mana, it is typically something that gates them during the laning phase. It says, hey, you can't cast your spells on cooldown right now. So then, if we then don't mana gate a character, what does that mean? Like, what are the things that they would probably do worse than? And the answer is this. It's some combination of their spells will likely be less reliable, less output, or higher cooldown. So we can use Yasuo as like a study of this. So, here, one second. Yasuo, his W, massive cooldown. That's what something, that's one thing that he needs to have on his W, given that he doesn't have mana, is just a really high cooldown. That's one of the things that he has there for that. His Q and E, they don't have a high cooldown. They're no cooldown practically. But in terms of their reliability, they specifically are like very melee range, you know, fairly melee gated. And in terms of Yasuo's Q3, the Tornado, it's like not the easiest thing in the world to hit. And then on top of that, they have lower output. If you actually like look at Yasuo's Q's damage, especially during the laning phase, any given Q, any given E isn't going to do a ton of damage if you compare it to like, say, a Jarvan Q, which is, you know, faster, longer range, and more damage. So similarly, like let's look at Viego, right? A really good comparison to do on Viego is the difference between Viego's Q and Jarvan's Q, right? So Viego's Q is pretty similar to Jarvan Q. Stab forward in a rectangle, deal damage. Jarvan Q has more range and does significantly more damage than Viego Q. One of the reasons it's allowed to do that is because Jarvan has mana. Of course, Jarvan's also jungler, and there's some weird stuff there, but like it's basically just like the general idea is that if these characters had mana, there would likely be some combination of shorter cooldowns, more reliability in certain ways, or higher outputs. And so, and then let's like take this in the other direction. Let's talk about Ziggs, right? Ziggs is a character with very high range in lane and very spammable spells. If Ziggs didn't have mana, that's the important part, because you're like, hey, what does this guy give up for having mana? Well, so let's talk about what Ziggs gets for having mana. If Ziggs didn't have mana, it would likely be that his Q would have to do some combination of less damage. It would likely be the case that his Q would have to do some combination of less damage, less range, or less or higher cooldown, right? Whereas because Ziggs has mana, he actually has a spell that overall, while being somewhat unreliable, has a very long range, a very decent damage, and a very low cooldown. But then mana gates him from spamming it, you know, every 4 seconds. This is also, by the way, why AD carries almost all have mana. Actually, I think they do all have mana. And one of the reasons you don't see a manaless AD carry in the laning phase is because AD carries have one of the most reliable, highest output, most low cooldown repeatable spells in the game. The ranged basic attack, right? And PS, they build AD. And AD carries ranged basic attack that's a lot stronger than, like, you know, certain other characters who build AP, right? And so, oftentimes, and that's another note about mana versus manaless characters, is you'll note that the majority of manaless characters in League of Legends are melee. And that's, like, not an accident that that's the case. Obviously, we have a couple ranged ones, like Kennen, for example, but the majority of manaless characters in League are melee. And one of the big reasons for that is that melee characters also have the downside of being melee as part of their kits that they have to consider as well. And so when mana is an attritional resource for, like, say, something like an AD carry, where they're like, you don't have to put your health bar at risk, and so you put your mana bar lower to do things. A character like Garen, every time he wants to interact with you, he's spending a resource to do it. It's his health. And yeah, he has the regen, but it's not going to always just instantly get him to full on laning phase, right? And so Garen is often using his health bar to cast his spells in the abstract. Because, you know, he has to, like, go close with you and fight you in that case. What does Tryndamere lose then? Okay, so yeah, let's talk about Tryndamere. First of all, Tryndamere loses... excuse me. He loses spell output. It's not necessarily that his spells are weak, but, like, his Q doesn't exactly burst you for damage, right? Like, he has to auto you a lot, right? His Q heals, which is nice, of course. But it's not as, say, reliable at, like, poking your opponent as, like, a Jarvan Q might be, right? Like, Tryndamere does have to get, like, literally in melee range of you to do anything. Now, he's very powerful when he gets literally in melee range of you, but it's not the case for, like, a lot of characters who, like, are going to have potentially, like, longer range threat. So that's one of the things Tryndamere loses. One of the major things Tryndamere loses for being manaless is, like, he also doesn't really have any way to exhibit threat on you outside of melee range. Aside from the W, if you're turned around, he can, like, slow you from range. His Q has 50 AD for free. Oh yeah, his Q is a decent spell. Like, it's not bad. But, like, it's not a Ziggs Q. It's not necessarily, like, a Ziggs Q or a Jarvan Q. Or a spell like that they can necessarily, like, you know, jump on you out of range with. We tie it back to, okay, what is mana? It's an attritional resource, right? The big thing going on with Tryndamere is, since he is so pure melee, a lot of the gator on Tryndamere, in a number of laning experience, is the fact that he has to find a way to get into melee range with you. Doesn't mean he's not super frustrating or anything like that, but that's not necessarily just simple or easy. So Tryndamere with mana would get damage on spells. Tryndamere with mana would probably, if he was truly mana gated, because remember, there's a difference between having mana and being mana gated. There's certain characters in the game where their mana costs are just fake, right? Like, they don't really exist. They pretend to exist, basically. In the case of Tryndamere, right, it might be that perhaps some of his, if he was truly mana gated, perhaps some of his spells would need to be lower cooldown. Perhaps some of his spells would need to do even more. This is the thing where it's like, if he was mana gated, perhaps his E would have to take him farther or deal more damage. Perhaps his Q would have to heal him for even more, since he can't heal infinitely, right? Like, Tryndamere has this thing where, as long as he's auto-attacking, he can heal a lot. That's another gate he has, by the way, is one of Tryndamere's gates is the fact that he has to auto-attack the wave to stack his healing, right? He doesn't just get to get maximum healing for free, he has to be on the wave. And of course, in a number of situations, he can do that easily, if you can't put pressure on him. But there's also a number of situations where he can't, because you can put pressure on him. It just depends on the lane matchup and who's there, right? And so, if Tryndamere's Q was double gated, both by mana and the need to stack it in melee range, it probably would have to heal for a lot more in an individual cast, or something like that. Or perhaps it wouldn't be gated by stacking into melee range. If he had mana, it's likely he wouldn't have the rage system, and so his Q would potentially just always heal him at full value no matter what, right? Which, you know, that has some costs and benefits to it.